Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, the topic is defending democracy. Tim Carey of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions talks to Stephanie Desmond about a new report about the dangers of armed insurrection and what can be done to tone down both violence in the public discourse and remove guns from political spaces. Let's listen.
Tim Carey, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
So today I want to talk to you about a new report that you're part of, and it's about defending democracy against the dangers of armed insurrection, which sounds extremely scary. And so I want you to give us tell us what it's about.
Yeah, well, I think you hit on a critical aspect there that it is scary. I mean, there are risks that we are seeing out in society today. From January 6th was perhaps the most egregious example, but we're seeing it in state legislatures, election offices, public demonstrations across the country of this increased prevalence of not only guns and firearms being used and displayed in places critical to political participation, but also increasing willingness of people to use them. Sometimes we have seen, but often in political rhetoric as well, people calling for the use of arms to achieve political ends, which is very antithetical to not just public health, public safety, but also the foundations of our democracy.
Mm-hmm. How did we get here? Short answer, of course.
Short answer. So we'll leave some of the history loose, but we'll say that there is a long history of use of violence to attempt to achieve political ends throughout our country. When you look back to the Whiskey Rebellion, the Shays Rebellion, somewhere around the founding, but largely which were both attempts of aggrieved minorities to try to overturn majority rule in the democratic system by using armed resistance. But perhaps most critically, we really need to be looking around more modern history. So looking back to the 90s with the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh, looking to the shoot-offs and standoffs in ranches around the Midwest from the various Bundy cases about using federal land and the conflicts that are there. But again, and a long shifting rhetoric in both from the gun advocacy organizations like the National Rifle Association, but also by various political figures about this willingness to use firearms to achieve political ends, not just as an option, but as our right, as a core interpretation of what the Second Amendment is and does. And not only is that a critical misreading of constitutional law, but it's also very much imperils our safety, operations of governance, and all of our other civil rights as well. And so it wasn't a sudden shift, but rather a slow escalation of a fringe idea of what we call this insurrectionary Second Amendment, which I can speak more on, that grew, again, from a more fringe view to something that's now entering more mainstream discourse, to where we hear public figures saying it, and we see people attempting to act on it. Mm-hmm. And that's why we think it's critical to share more information about it now, as well as potential policy solutions to help address it, to prevent it from becoming a more significant problem with more significant consequences.
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about people who, have insurrection as their goal, or are we talking about people who are angry and they're carrying their weapons, and that's just a scary mix?
Yeah, so sometimes it's really hard to tell intentionality when there's the public carrying of a firearm. And that's something that's been increasingly complicated by the stratification of states in applying gun laws, like now so more than ever, there's a broad variance of some states going far in one direction, saying that you can do unlicensed public carry, this whole notion of permitless or constitutional carry, where you see far more firearms being used and displayed out in public, and then you have some states that are that you need licenses to carry firearms in public. You have to go through certain tests and to ensure that you meet some level of competency for only using a firearm before you bring it in a public sphere. And because of that, in the states where there aren't these licenses, where there aren't these protective laws, it's really unclear what or why someone would be carrying a firearm in a public place for. And even for many people, the firearms communicate a singular message of that I am dangerous and I can harm you. And that's something that can overwrite whatever other message those people hope to convey. Mm-hmm. And so it leads to, again, this great uncertainty of what people are doing with these weapons, why they're bringing them into these spaces, and what it means for other people trying to share those spaces.
When I hear the word insurrection, I, of course, immediately think of January 6th. And I don't recall there being a lot of guns at January 6th. Am I missing something?
No, you're absolutely right there. And even though January 6th is probably the most recent egregious example of insurrection that we can think of, which was indeed violent, but it wasn't largely armed. And there's, at least with firearms, and a significant reason for that was because of DC's protective gun laws. There was a stockpile of arms being held in Virginia by some groups that may or may not have been ready to be used if the need arose, but those firearms didn't end up making it into the Capitol, again, because of fear of enforcement over these laws. And so even though that day was devastating, it resulted in death and harm and fear, it fortunately was not as severe as it could have been had these protections not been in place.
What can we do to make our society safer? I mean, because that's really isn't that at the core of what you're saying?
Yeah, more or less, because even though DC had these protective laws that was able to help minimize some of the risk of harm that occurred, many states across the country don't. And we've seen, especially during the 2020 elections and the days that followed, and also as well during the COVID-19 crisis and the lockdowns of several cities, we saw what happened when there weren't these protections in place. The most perhaps well-known example is the Michigan Capitol, where there were viral videos about legislators looking up over the rafters over them and seeing people with guns like standing over them, trying to police what they were doing. And it just created this atmosphere of fear and concern that shook to the core of their ability to make decisions on behalf of their constituents. And we've also seen that outside of voting centers and in public protests as well. And we know that we have an evidence basis for many of these laws, and seeing that when implemented well and correctly, there can be decreases in violence, decreases in deadly outcomes. And ultimately, it also creates a flourishing environment for democracy to take place, an environment that is peaceful, because that is essentially what is the core of democracy, is the ability for people to share their collective voices, to make change based off those voices and not off of other factors, such as, in the case of insurrection, violence, which is trying to overturn the will of majority. And so with that being said, there's five policy recommendations we recommend largely to states to adopt. Also, we encourage some practice recommendation as well, which can be enacted without any form of legal or legislative action at all. And largely, these laws are focused around where firearms can be, who can carry them, and providing different tools that if a risk of violence is identified or credible, then we could prospectively mitigate it at the outset to prevent a crisis from occurring.
So what are some of your recommendations?
Yeah, so there's So I'll walk through the list, and I can give it fairly top level, and I'm happy to go into any of these in a little more detail. But we start off initially with just regulating the public carry of firearms. And largely what that means is not preventing wholesale from people for carrying firearms in public, but largely having mechanisms to ensure that people who carry firearms in public are people who are legally allowed to carry firearms, and assuring that they not just pass background checks, but also can have a degree of competency with safety training, or have had their fingerprints taken, which we've shown has been helpful in mitigating risks of arms trafficking. And essentially, again, giving some sense that if someone is carrying a gun out in public, they have a license or registration to be doing so to provide a degree of comfort about their ability to safely use the weapon and also why they may have it. We also look at strengthening the laws or creating laws that regulate paramilitary activity, which is essentially what a lot of folks look at as militias. Even though like modern militias are largely a bit of a misnomer, because the history of the term militia goes back to, again, a body of the public that is armed and trained by local governments. And a lot of these paramilitary groups that we've seen showing up at different events around January 6th and others are not trained and led by the state. They're wholly private individuals, unaccountable to any will of any people aside from themselves. And largely these groups are outlawed, but some of these regulations are very old, some are not very well enforced, if enforced at all. And so ensuring that those laws are up to date and active and being applied can help mitigate the risks of armed groups trying to, again, usurp public opinion. We also encourage the limiting of firearms or prohibiting of firearms in places essential to political participation. So we're looking at polling places, we're looking at legislative buildings, looking at protests, all of which to protect core functions of government and civil discourse. And because we've seen examples in the past few years of how firearms in all of these locations has not just caused physical harm, but also has directly impeded in the ability of ballots to be cast, legislators to do their jobs, people to go and practice their First Amendment rights at protests without fear of being harmed by others. Fourth, we ask for the enactment and implementation of extreme risk protection orders, which are also known as red flag laws, which allow states to temporarily disarm people who are posing a high risk of violence at that point in time. We also look to creating or repealing or amending state preemption laws to allow for local governments to regulate firearms in these certain situations. So that one may be a little more nuanced. Happy to go into it in more detail. And our last recommendation, which is not policy-based at all, it's more just a practice, is to break the insurrectionist permission structure by openly denouncing violence. We had other researchers at Johns Hopkins and their partner universities do extensive political science research on this risk of partisan divides and violence and willingness to engage in violence. And I think Liliana Mason is the faculty member from Johns Hopkins who worked on this research. And a key finding was that, yes, politicians, leaders, people that are viewed as leaders espousing violence can incite violence, make people who follow and trust them more willing to commit violence, which seems implicitly understood by most. But a key finding as well is that if those same voices denounce violence, that it also has the inverse effect. So if these figures, instead of calling for violence or doing nothing, actively denounce violence, it's shown that, at least through public opinion, it makes people who look up to those leaders feel less likely or less willing to commit acts of violence. And that's as simple as just communication style. And so we encourage both these policy recommendations as well as for leaders and even people in their interpersonal conversations to be very explicit in the messaging that violence is never acceptable in the political space. And we need to leave room for the operations of government, for civil rights and public discourse.
Of course, I'd love you to go into more detail on all of this, but we are out of time. And so we'll leave a link on our website to the report. Tim Carey, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.